Good morning, everybody. Good evening, good early evening to our speaker. I'm James Rondo. I'm the president and Eloise W. Martin Director of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to the Butler-VanderLinden Lecture on Architecture, a series which brings leading voices in contemporary design and architecture to our audiences. I want to personally extend my terrific gratitude to John and to Jack for their ongoing support of our museum, and especially of the Department of Architecture and Design. Today, we have the exceptional honor of hearing from world-renowned architect Rem Koolhaas. He will discuss a fundamental strand of his practice, exhibition making. Joining Rem is Irene Sunwoo. I'm thrilled to say the museum's new John H. Bryan Chair and Curator of Architecture and Design. Irene is an architectural historian and curator who joins our museum from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she had been the curator of the Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery and director of exhibitions there since 2016. Irene brings a distinctive vision to our architecture and design department, fusing a scholarly approach to content with innovative exhibition design. So we're so happy to have you here with us, Irene, in your new role at the museum. And so I'd now like to again extend my great gratitude to Rem and turn the program over to Irene to speak a bit more about Rem's extraordinary ongoing career. Thank you, Rem. Thank you, Irene. And thanks to everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for the kind introduction. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to be in conversation with such a distinguished guest on my first day working at the Art Institute. And before we begin, I also want to recognize Jack Butler and John VanderLinden, for whom this lecture series is named. Their generous gift to the Art Institute has allowed the museum to host conversations with an exceptional roster of leading architects, including today's speaker, Rem Koolhaas. And many thanks to Ann Goldstein, Deputy Director at the museum and its chair and curator of modern and contemporary art, whose behind the scenes efforts really helped make this event possible. And I'd also like to thank Rita Varyabedian for her assistance and valuable insights. And thanks also, of course, to Joe Iverson, Courtney Graham, and the Art Institute events team for their logistical and technical support. So our guest today, Rem Koolhaas, is a prolific architect and writer. Over the past 4 decades, Rem, who founded the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in 1975, has designed and realized projects across the world that demonstrate a deep commitment to complex and thought-provoking briefs, a keen interest in forward-thinking clients, and a seemingly insatiable curiosity about what architecture can do and be. And his built projects are staggering in number and scope. Close to home is the McCormick Tribune Campus Center at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Completed in 2003, that project was actually previewed in our galleries in 1998. And it's worth noting that the New York office of OMA is also responsible for the forthcoming UIC Center for the Arts in Chicago. But Rem himself has steered so many notable projects, including the Axel Springer campus in Berlin, the Qatar National Library, the headquarters for China Central Television or CCTV in Beijing, and the Seattle Central Library. And among his current projects is the Taipei Performing Arts Center. But exquisite art institutions also abound in his portfolio, such as the Fondation Galerie Lafayette in Paris, the Fondazione Prada in Milan, which we'll hear about today, and the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow. But Rem is also an expert maker of exhibitions, a longstanding part of his practice that we'll be discussing in detail today. And so we're honored to have you joining us, Rem, from Amsterdam. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Looking forward to this conversation tremendously. Before we jump in, I just wanted to note for our audience a little preview of the framework and format of the event today. We're going to be talking specifically about exhibitions that Rem has kind of handpicked from his career. And what a great opportunity to pick your brain, Rem, since we're talking in the context of a museum where exhibitions is really the heart and soul of what we do. And you have an incredibly high IQ in exhibition making, having been, or still am, an exhibition designer, a curator, but also the founder of AMO, the research arm of OMA. And so I just want to let the audience know that we're going to be having a conversation, and you are welcome to enter any questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom, and we'll be able to filter them out and pose them to Rem in real time. So Rem, I'll let you begin with your slides. And I know that we wanted to talk first about some time before you even got into architecture, because you had made the point as we were preparing this event, how exhibitions had been so integral to your early thinking in your youth, especially specifically in your time in Amsterdam. So could you walk us through some maybe formative projects and experiences?
Yeah, thank you. I was extremely lucky that I grew up. I grew up in partly in Amsterdam. I came back from Indonesia when I was 12, and that was the exact moment when the Amsterdam State Museum was directed by Willem Sandberg. You see him here. A very charismatic, courageous, and radical museum director who had just finished the so-called New Ring. It was an extremely modest building, 40 by 14 meter, and it had glass windows, so totally incorrect in terms of current museum practice. But he organized there an amazing series of exhibitions that totally coincided with my own awakening of a kind of visual sensibility and of a kind of my sensitivity to certain forms of thinking, basically. It was a wonderful moment because it was the mid-50s. And it was the beginning of a collaborative attitude between European artists and also between European and American artists. Here you see Ken Rauschenberg and Jean Tinguely, who was a kind of French sculptor. And basically, there was a kind of no threshold whatsoever in this museum. So you could enter almost any moment, and you could even enter when exhibitions were made. And in those days, when I was a teenager, I spent almost every day there, at least a couple of hours. These are some of the kind of exhibitions, and one that was kind of particularly striking to me was one about the Zero movement. You see kind of radical experimentation with immaterial kind of aesthetics, and that kind of really marked me more or less forever. And my interest in exhibitions is kind of really triggered by this sequence of exhibitions that I experienced, and which demonstrated to me that an exhibition could be an extremely important and extremely efficient way of conveying ideas, of creating pleasure, and of exploiting a particular moment, because that is the beautiful thing about exhibitions. They begin, but they also end. And of course, in architecture, there's always the kind of heaviness of permanence and the lightness of something temporary was a fundamental attraction to the idea of exhibition.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting looking through some of these shows that you cited and seeing the diversity of work. So a lot of kinetic works of sculpture, but also performance and happenings, but also works that are more conceptual and minimalist. And I think that a lot of these qualities actually come out in a lot of the later projects that we'll see in very dense and extreme ways, and also in more subtle ways later on. So it'll be interesting to circle back to some of these projects as we move through the sequence.
Okay, maybe this I forgot to say, this was an exhibition of Yves Klein and also of Zero, and this made, as you can imagine, a kind of stunning impression on somebody who at the time was 20. Both the kind of beauty, but the wildness were kind of deeply exciting, and actually, if I see it now, it's still deeply exciting. Anyway, we have an architectural office on the main, and we have a counter office, so to speak, where we do this kind of thing, and I think that the interaction between those two is very important. So let me start this museum, this exhibition. This was an interesting exhibition. It was an architectural exhibition in the Triennale building in Milan, building from the fascist period, very formalistic, where they had given me part of a curved plan, and where I needed to basically make a statement supposedly about architecture. It was the time that the Barcelona pavilion of Mies van der Rohe was being reconstructed in real time, in reality. And I was actually very critical of that, because I thought the Barcelona pavilion is a black and white myth, and it's extremely exciting as that myth. And personally, I didn't necessarily feel the need to actually see it in real as reality, because I thought it would be losing its aura. So I did my own ironic reconstruction, or prestige reconstruction, because I had a curved side, and of course the Barcelona pavilion is all about rectilinearity. And so basically I had to curve Mies. And Mies is a very important person that I still don't understand, but I've tried my entire life to really understand the real dimensions of him. And
but
so,
if I can interrupt you, also, I think important, this interesting comment that you don't understand Mies, but at this moment in architectural culture, let's say, this was a very pointed provocation actually about modernism more generally. So could you speak a little bit about that aspect of the project? It's about Mies, but it's also about perceptions about the legacy of modernism.
yeah, well, I think that the 80s were a kind of pretty complex kind of moment, because of course, as you know, in America, they were the beginning triumph of postmodernism. And even in Europe, it was the beginning of a kind of serious postmodern development. And actually, it was a struggle at the time whether modernism would remain or would retain some kind of viability in Europe, but it was not sure. And so maybe it was kind of risky to talk about Mies in that context, and also to seemingly parody Mies. But my real intention in curving it was to suggest that there is a kind of very different dimension to Mies, that Mies is not only a kind of like linear dogmatic person, but I think Mies is a kind of very voluptuous and very experimental, and in a certain way, and it sounds ironic, an almost formless architect. And so I've been trying many times to try to bring out his unconscious, and making it curve was one way of doing it. Of course, we didn't have a budget, so it was all kind of done with lemonade. But I have to say that seeing the Barcelona pavilion in curves was also quite a nice experience. In pictures, you always see all traces of the environment stripped, but actually it was built for the World's Fair in a kind of very classical experience, full of columns. And those
Can you talk in a little more detail about some of the items that you're placing in this installation?
Well, I think that at the time I was also kind of very interested in Mies's relationship with Lily Reich, who was an interior designer, who basically had a deep influence on him. and that influence kind of somehow was not really properly recognized for what it was. And she enabled Mies to and worked with Mies to explore the effects of wearing radical colors. And that is what I was kind of trying to hint at here. And basically, of course, we didn't in the 80s build architecture for its own sake anymore. So the pavilion had to have a purpose. And at that time, it was a kind of, I decided it could also work extremely well as a fitness center. But one of the items was a TV where I had basically, where I was showing a film of not so much the reconstruction of Mies, but what actually happened to the remnants of the Mies Pavilion, how they had been kind of dismantled, of course, and then transported, and how they then kind of, with great effort, arrived at some point in Nazi Germany, and how basically after the war they were uncrated in Berlin, but that at the time was the communist part of Germany, East Germany, and how in the end it was decided to kind of reconstruct it as part of a petrol station in East Berlin. So I had my own alternative history that in a way seemed more interesting than the bland rebuilding.
So here, this is an example of you also drawing upon your background in filmmaking, because you had done some script writing previously to this moment. So can you talk a little bit about the making of the film? Was it just you, or were there other people involved? Were you the script?
You know, of course, basically in architecture is never you. Yeah, it's always a group of people. It's always a band of people. And the great thing about exhibitions is that that band is kind of pretty much reduced, because the scale of a team has to be quite can be quite limited. So. In a way, in that sense, exhibition is also kind of very personal territory. And yes, I think that I don't want to overestimate my experience as a filmmaker. You know, it was kind of pretty short, but I think that narrative has always been a crucial component of what I try to do, and narratives may be another word, of, as I said, of trying to understand things, and trying explaining to myself what is going on.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience about this project. They write, Casa Palestra seems explicitly theatrical. It is an installation and an exhibition of architecture at life-size scale. Is theatricality an important concept for your exhibition making?
Not always, no. Actually, I have to say that, of course, the Barcelona Pavilion itself was extremely theatrical. It was a pavilion that basically was supposed to kind of represent the new spirit of Germany, and that was opened by the King of Spain, and that actually served only a kind of single ceremony, namely the kind of signing of the guest book by the king. And so it was kind of really the theatricality in this case was not mine, but it was Mises. And of course, in the context of an exhibition, it is not so much theatricality you're looking for, but more how you can make something stand out in a given context, or how you can create a certain intensity in a given context. And therefore, I guess dislodging expectation is one of the strategies.
Okay, I think that's a great segue for the next project, speaking about dislodging.
Okay, the next project, in a way, is very similar, or is a kind of similar situation, but it was organized in Venice in 2013, where sponsored by Prada, Jamal Chaland, the curator, the famous Italian curator, who unfortunately kind of died recently, and Thomas Demand, we were asked, or we worked on recreating a kind of very famous exhibition from '69 that Harold Zeeman had initiated. It was an amazing exhibition in a kind of fairly classical building where almost any one of the kind of artists who later became important and still are important in certain cases was kind of represented. And it seemed, and Jamal Chaland found it kind of very interesting to reconstruct it. But of course, the reconstruction could never be kind of very complete because it was supposed to be reconstructed in a Venetian palazzo. And so, you know, the three of us looked a lot very, very carefully, and we had many alternatives how we could kind of represent the idea of the exhibition. Here you see Joseph Beuys. Here you see the kind of mood and atmosphere of those things. And for me, also kind of wonderful how incredibly people, artists at that point were able to invest really extremely casual material or daily material with incredible meaning. And basically, in the end, almost desperately, I took the plan of the Swiss building and printed it on transparent paper and looked whether it could be fitted in, first of all, but whether also kind of certain walls and certain structures could be made to coincide. And that was for me a really crucial moment because I discovered that actually it was a bit silly to work on one architecture if you could also create simultaneously two different architectures, and it became a demonstration that maybe two different architectures could coexist anywhere, and that there would be a fantastic relationship and kind of accidents between those two architectures that could be very revealing. And here you see the effects. So we reconstructed the bare room, including the kind of floors, but then suddenly there was this obstacle in it, but some of that obstacle also made all these casual kind of works. Some of them were actually authentic works, kind of really gave it a totally new dimension and new challenge. And here again you see how the classical and the strict coincided beautifully. And for instance, this was a work about a kind of reclining figure, and that by total coincidence coincided with the reclining figure in a mural.
Rem, can I ask you if, well, also just to back up to clarify for the audience that this is a reconstruction of an exhibition that perhaps didn't have a plan to begin with, right? As I understand it, for Zeeman, the artists were invited and kind of in a sequence when they showed up, were able to find a place to install their work and kind of improvise and respond directly to the site. So I heard Germano Chaland say that the artist Flanagan with the rope piece was the last one to show up. And so he found a spot and just pulled his rope through 4 different rooms, and that was the last piece. So for the curator, it was also about preserving those relationships between the artists themselves, because they were in dialogue while they were installing their work, but also between the artist relationships to the specific site. So there's actually like a double agency to this project.
You explain it much better than I. But kind of one of the reasons I didn't mention is that in a way that kind of casualness, or maybe it's a seeming casualness, but an embrace of a degree of randomness, such as the kind of sequence of arrival, you know, is fundamental, almost also to my own mentality or sensibility. So, you know, for me, it was kind of extremely moving to be able to reconstruct that sensibility in a totally opposite condition.
Yeah, because there was so much precision actually in what you had to do. I mean, even the details of the fitting of the new walls against all of the ornamental details, that's often a beautiful detail that's used in documentations of this newer version of the show.
But so it was, and for instance, the collaboration there with Germano and Thomas Dumont, I mean, that kind of thing almost never happens in architecture. Yeah? That you have maybe a kind of preparation of 3 months where you collaborate very, very intensely on something which is seemingly kind of remote of your daily obligations.
We have an audience question,
Yeah.
which is Harold Zeeman, Germano Celan, and other well-known curators developed a signature style in their careers, or let's say approach. How do you think about curatorial authorship or style in your own exhibition making?
Well, I am, the word signature is one of the words that in my book immediately raises kind of red lights. I think that what was extremely interesting is to work I've worked with Germano many times, and I would say that the word signature is kind of really not the right word. It is, of course, somebody with a certain intelligence and a certain number of experiences that certainly color what he's doing. But I think the versatility, but also the unpredictability and the daring of the range of somebody like Germano was kind of really amazing and very inspiring. Because, for instance, Germano, I think very soon after doing this, he did basically an exhibition about food in the Triennale building in the context of the World's Fair in Milan. There was something completely different, something he had never done before, something where basically his whole repertoire of curatorial tricks would be useless, and yet he totally embraced that. And I think that you know, I'm sure you can say exactly the same about Zeeman.
Okay, so that's a great prompt to move on to the next project, which is wildly different and maybe was wildly different for you also, serial classic, working with antiquities. So why don't you walk us into this?
Well, what was then not very shortly after, we were asked to, or I was asked to do for the opening of the Prada Foundation exhibition, and in this case, absolutely not curatorial, but as an exhibition design for an exhibition about antiquities, and specifically about how a lot of Roman sculpture was based on models developed by Greeks. And so it was actually kind of showing Roman sculpture almost as a kind of generic form of artistic production. And that was a theory of an Italian academic, Salvatore Settis. So again, we worked very closely together. But, you know, and I am also lucky that I personally in classical education and was familiar with Greek and Latin, and of course, you know, which is one of the paradoxes of modern architect, being a modern architect, that, you know, no one has ever asked a single time whether I was interested in Roman architecture or what Roman architecture meant for me. And I can say that Roman architecture is kind of one of the driving inspirations or challenges for me, almost every day. But anyway, so I started looking carefully and became almost obsessed with the contradiction of the vivid and alive impact of the sculpture and the dead implications of a sokol. And this is another example. The sculpture moves intensely, and then the kind of sokol holds him back. And so I was kind of thinking, is there another way of showing this? And so the theme or that I wanted to investigate with this show is there a way of undoing the effect of sokol? Or and it was extremely difficult to convince, of course, any one who was taking care of sculpture that you could remove sokols. So we had to embed the sokols in the ground, and in that way it worked. So we had an exhibition of a kind of landscape of acrylic plates covered in the travertine floor tiles of the exhibition. And basically, in that way, we could create an environment where the sculptures could talk to each other, where there was a kind of much more freer way of combining sculptures or creating groups or didactically explaining things about the buildings. But even more importantly, where basically the public could walk at the same level and on the same ground.
Could you talk a little bit about the conversations with the curator and those frictions? I mean, was there a lot of convincing that you had to do, or were they?
So basically, the sculptures came from many different museums and many different collections. So that was hardly a conversation. It was just a question: can we remove the sokol? And in every different communication, the result was no. So it was not really a conversation. It was just a given that we couldn't separate them, and that therefore we needed to have another form of ingenuity, which was to embed them in the landscape. So this had nothing to do with Satis. With Satis, it was a real conversation, and of course he had to kind of swallow also, because he had his entire life kind of considered the so-called an essential part of the sculpture, but when he saw basically this prototype, I think he became convinced, because here you could see, the top layer and the kind of direct relationship between the sculpture and how almost as a kind of underwater condition, you could still see the sokols. So here you have some kind of insulation shots and see the effect of what a crowd of those kind of sculptures or a group of those kind of sculpture, how much more intense the interaction becomes if the sokols are gone. Here you see also kind of perhaps that the landscape, the model of a landscape also gave a kind of datum plane to all the sculptures rather than kind of independent entities to all of them. Here again.
This is, I mean, I think this project is so amazing, but also hearing you speak about it, it's interesting how there's this divergence of the curatorial agenda and the design agenda, which are married so beautifully and work together. Because as I understand it, for the curator, and it should be mentioned that the Prada Foundation in Milan is dedicated to contemporary sculpture. And this was his first exhibition, which was a pretty radical gesture, which I know was, kind of based on an argument that this concept of seriality, which we associate, with contemporary art as a practice, actually existed in antiquity, and therefore it's a way to bridge these kind of different periods within art history in this rigorous way. But here you are departing from that, but still amplifying and supporting it with this pretty amazing scheme. And I just wanted to ask you also about the floor plane as a site of architectural invention, because it is something that you play with quite a bit in projects. I think about Maison Bordeaux or even Galerie Lafayette, Anticipation. So could you talk about that as a kind of maybe untapped architectural element to manipulate?
Yes, that's an extremely good question, and you know, basically, I think you can say that a lot of the pre-war kind of modern architecture is about the original ground. You take some of the villas of Mies van der Rohe, you see kind of some of the houses of the kind of Bauhaus of Le Corbusier. Very few of them are about kind of high rises. And I think it's only because I lived more or less the 70s in America and kind of working on the whole idea of high rise, that I so basically because most of the pre-war initial modernism is about the free plan, and that is because you're not basically creating kind of many levels, you maybe 2 or 3, but therefore if you want to experiment, you experiment with the plan. But then in the 70s I came in Manhattan and in New York and started and actually had the observation, okay, if you can work on the plan as a modernist and create a free plan, as Le Corbusier famously did, maybe you can reinvent modernism issue if you work on a free section. On the section. And so basically, once I did that, the floor plane became a much more interesting condition. Maybe I don't know whether this is a good explanation, but you're here and so for an articulated feeling for the first time.
Yeah, well, I think this is a good transition to the Prada Transformer, actually.
Okay, so one more thing. Here you see also kind of how the interaction with kind of people was really different. And the great thing about working intimately with a foundation was that, you know, as soon as the buildings, the sculptures were removed, ballet took their kind of place.
And you knew that this performance was going to take place beforehand?
Yeah, we knew it, and we also kind of plotted it. And in a certain way, this was again the same discovery of exhibitions that, you know, why have only one architecture if you can have two? Why only one reality if you can also have two? And this is another kind of issue about the floor and the section. I personally feel that it's very important in order to, and this is a very old-fashioned kind of 60s argument, to avoid an impression of elitism, that if you're outside the culture institution, you can also look inside and more or less see what is going on. So that really explains the kind of the design of this component of the Prada Foundation. Outside is almost a better experience than inside. Anyway, again, good working for Prada, and this is maybe also an important kind of thing to say. There is kind of working for corporations, and an architect working for a corporation is kind of very often not so much accused, but almost tagged with the label of neoliberalism, kind of simply because a corporation like Prada is, of course, part of the capitalist system. But at the same time, I would say that this kind of work, you know, is which is work where a public client never would be interested in having you explore it, and nevertheless, it's very crucial as part of the development of what architecture can be. So therefore, I think this tag of neoliberalism needs to be kind of discussed, perhaps. Anyway, Prada asked me to do something for 4 different events that they wanted to organize in Seoul, in Korea. And each event was totally different. There'd be an exhibition of fashion, an exhibition of art, a cinema, and a kind of special event. And basically, we said they were so different that we create a different plan for each of them, kind of circle, cross, a hexagon, kind of rectangle, and then we organize them in a kind of pyramid, and then we wrap that pyramid in the kind of skin that they also use to wrap abandoned planes in the Arizona desert to preserve them. And so it was semi-translucent.
What is this site again? Which?
In Korea, it's a kind of site in the heart of Seoul.
But the building in the background, is it a temple?
Famous temple, and we had a fantastic luxury that we could be in front of that temple. Korea is a kind of country that we worked in, and for which I have a kind of enormous sympathy. So we were able to also kind of relate to the history of Korea. But anyway, so basically each of those plans could be activated, so to speak, by kind of tilting and lifting the building and then tilt it. And so the building kind of assumed a completely new identity, every 6 weeks or every 4 weeks, because the exhibitions in Asia are kind of typically very short. And therefore the building had a new appearance, but of course, and from the inside, you also couldn't recognize the kind of shape anymore. So here you see it as a kind of cinema, here you see it as an art space. So, and here as a kind of fashion show. So it was a really wonderful experience, and kind of we have no idea how, I don't want to kind of sound like a martyr or like a victim, but how kind of relentless the kind of work of an architecture can kind of be in certain places or in certain times, and how long, certain architectural projects take 6 years, 8 years. So in order to activate your brain, it's really crucial to do this kind of tests. Here you see it again. And so in the end, it was surrendered to the Korean and to the Korean both sports and art scenes, and they made it their own.
So I have 2 questions. I read an interview with you and Micha Prada about this, and you seemed it seems like you were very reluctant to actually take this project on, and that the second part of the question is maybe what is your attitude towards the pavilion, and would you call this a pavilion?
Well, I think that there has been such a proliferation of pavilions that yes, it's true that if the word pavilion is kind of raised, it's at this point not the most attractive proposition for me. But I don't really remember that interview, and also kind of doubt to some extent that they would have called it a pavilion. It was more a space in which they could organize some events. And also, I don't necessarily remember reluctance, but I remember impasse. It was incredibly difficult for us to think of something, because we first thought of something flexible, something that can accommodate different programs, but that somehow seemed to slack and to mediocre. And it's only when we thought that the building could not could actually assume different identities, that it triggered something really exciting. I think that there's something which is really unique about architecture, because there is almost no profession that has to perform or mobilize inspiration at the beginning, at the right moment. Yeah. And there's a kind of really weird moment in architecture where a client asks you something, knows exactly what they want, and almost on the spot you have to be inspired and have a convincing answer that either can reinforces the client's ideas or replaces them with something even more exciting. So there's something weird about having to mobilize inspiration at the exact beginning of a project, and with exhibitions, it's of course even more. So it's also a form of challenging your own ability.
And having a client like Prada seems like an amazing resource, because clearly there's a willingness to experiment in so many different types of contexts.
Yeah, but it's not only their willingness to experiment, but also their extremely sometimes harsh and precise judgment.
Mm. And it's interesting also that you've been doing designs for their fashion shows as well, which I think have a similar sensibility in terms of the design approach, in that you're dealing with very specific small scale scenarios that are very much about the human body and the interaction with the space, and from colors to textures, etc.
True.
Okay, so
yeah. Okay.
do you
So
want to?
I maybe we go to next thing, because it's now I'm kind of dealing with things that are maybe kind of more initiated by ourselves, or that basically were not responses to an outside demand, but were kind of more felt urgencies about kind of certain conditions. And this is one of them. This is also a pavilion, you could say. It's also tent material. And it was an exhibition about Europe that we organized in 2004. And it was part of a kind of realization which I think is shared almost worldwide, that Europe is a kind of very promising identity, but that the whole idea of the European Union has rarely been kind of represented in a way that is appealing or even understandable. There's a kind of famous quip of Kissinger already 20 years or 30 years, what is her phone number? And the diffuseness of the kind of entire organization is a kind of really serious problem. So in the last 15 years, I've been deeply active and deeply committed to try to overcome an iconographic deficit or an inability to communicate, or an inability to represent a complex idea. And I cannot say it's been particularly successful, but nevertheless, it was a kind of passionate involvement. So here, what we wanted to kind of represent is the history of Europe, and why the European Union made sense within that history, and why the whole idea of United Europe was actually an amazing idea, and also an amazing kind of realization. So in the center of Brussels, we have this tent. The colors are basically the combined flags of every single nation. And we represented European history, the Enlightenment, the kind of French Revolution, but also in all its ghastly and gory moments. And against that, we also represented the beginning of the European Union, and how amazing and how heroic it actually was in 1951 to connect previously intense enemies that had basically kind of mutually almost killed each other, and how somehow the creation of an administrative entity to overcome and transcend that hostility by politicians was actually a fantastic, deeply impressive effort. And so we identify a lot of kind of people that were involved, French, German, and even English, and basically represented in the pavilion. So here the history of Europe from the kind of Greeks to now, and then behind it the kind of history of the European Union. And basically because we felt that we needed to, that the narrative was so lacking in heroism or in explicitness, we also created some hero sculptures. This was Monet, Jean Monnet, the Frenchman who initiated the kind of first step. And one of maybe for me the most exciting things was Europe is always criticized for being kind of an incredible accumulation of rules. Here we published all the rules of Europe in a kind of single book. It was a book that was kind of 24 feet long, I think 70,000 pages, kind of insane. But for me, it was very important to say that something like this is in the 20th century and still more heroic than saber rattling, because it is a kind of collective effort to improve standards, to share rights, and to basically create in a very methodical way a better life for a large continent.
Okay, so here I'll jump in with one of my questions and also one from the audience, which I'll give to you at the same time. So this rule book is demonstrating this methodical tendency that you're talking about, but this is also really evident in your presentation and just the kind of insanity of the research too. Right? We get the sense that you want to know everything, absolutely, and that there's a kind of pleasure in presenting it all. And, we could even think of the timeline as a consistent tool for AMO and in a lot of these research exhibitions. So on the one hand, we could talk about this completist attitude in terms of the research method. And then in tandem with that, the audience question is, some OMA produced exhibitions, such as Countryside, but I think this applies for the image of Europe as well, have an agitprop quality to them. They are confrontational, collage-like, sometimes unrelenting. Why is that?
Well, I think that it's kind of probably also to do a lot with this my generation, and I think that that's why this kind of beginning in the 60s in Amsterdam, which in themselves were extremely turbulent and almost more turbulent than kind of the 60s in France, and also, I think for every person interested in modernity, the word agitprop is an important word because it suggests, to me at least, that you're not entirely happy with the existing situation, and that therefore you want to agitate. Yes, it is true that our exhibitions are not always polite, although I think that we can be polite, for instance, in the case of the Roman sculptures. But I think that when the exhibitions is to some extent about our own deeply felt convictions, I maybe, you know, naively think that there is a connection between agitation and deeply felt.
And I think also accessibility as well. There's a
Yeah, an explanation. Yeah.
okay.
And I think that this is of course a kind of very interesting, but maybe we discuss it in the context of the GONAP.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What was kind of very nice is that basically this space became immediately, because there was this explicit kind of raising of politics and of the kind of purpose of the EU. It became also the kind of center of a lot of political agitation, which could never find a place in the kind of anonymity of the European bureaucracy, but here suddenly it was kind of brought to boiling point almost. Anyway, now I talk about kind of Mies. I have to talk about Mies again. Content. In 2003-4, we were extremely happy to be invited to do an exhibition in the National Gallery in Berlin, Mrs. Building, Mrs. Glass Building. And what you have to know when you see the exhibition is that it was supposed to be the last exhibition before the building was renovated. Of course, I hoped intensely that I would also be the architect of the renovation, but probably the exhibition design convinced the powers that be against that. But anyway, so this was the beginning, the opening of the show, the title, and this was the plan. And for this plan, we took a plan that we had developed once for a project in France, where we were basically saying you cannot control built substance anymore, but what you can still control is areas of void space, of parks, of areas along a highway or along a kind of railway track. And basically then whatever is built in between in the white part can assume its current almost generic identity. So we projected that plan on the pavilion of Mies, and so black was the environment where you could walk, and then there were islands randomly shaped for each of the different components. Basically, people would say that we were shockingly unsympathetic or shockingly desecrating, and of course that was also in the title, desecrating Mies. But my deepest conviction is that not only Mies would have loved the show, but that actually this is also Mies. There is a deeply expressionistic streak in Mies. Also explicitly in its history, Mies was a kind of supporter of Dada, was a supporter of Schwitters, was interested in Merzbau, was interested in all the kind of experimentation in the beginning of the century, but kind of somehow able to sublimate it without killing it, or without actually. And so what we were doing here was kind of simply. And this kind of model was simply showing the kind of repressed in Mies, or the return of the repressed. It's a kind of really fantastically kind of popular show where we created kind of walls that more or less defined the kind of circulation, but the walls were full of information, and of course for a series of high rises, special models that were either inflatables or made out of tree trunks or kind of hanging symbols. There was an opening, of course. We worked with Tony Arsler. Tony Arsler had basically a text of mine, Junk Space, that was kind of hung around the exhibition in certain places and presented me as a kind of gloomy gloomy visionary, partly, of course, as an act. And here you see the intensity of the show, but also the intensity of the way it was perceived. I think there's a kind of horrible prejudice against content in exhibitions. As if the current audiences are too illiterate or lazy or uninterested in spending time. Here and even in our countryside show, we met people who spent hours and hours and hours in the kind of show and actually absorbing it. So here you see, and basically we took some elements of not only the aesthetic, but the wayfinding of supermarkets to indicate what the different areas were, and we're also kind of very emphatic about the kind of presence of China and the potential proximity between China and Europe. It didn't really happen that way, but I still think it's an important message for something that needs to happen sooner or later.
So this,
yeah.
Oh, this is a great slide to land on for my question. So for this show, it's really a reflection on the work of AMO and OMA to date during this period. So it's just your projects. But, I wonder if you could comment on the issue of icons, because today you seem very hesitant to use that word, especially when it comes to your own practice. But here you're kind of forced to reckon with the icons that you're producing in the format of an exhibition. So what's your kind of feeling on that dilemma?
I think that basically it is not so much a word icon that I object to, but what I totally object to is the kind of formulation of the word star architect, which basically kind of emerged in the 90s and which has become synonymous with a kind of ogre with very few human feelings, no respect for clients or users, and basically an egomaniac who approaches the world indifferently. And I think that is a creation of critics who were basically confronted with a situation of extreme complexity that they couldn't kind of handle themselves. And I think that if you use the word icon became a word that was applied to architecture in the 90s and the last 20 years. But if you look at the Mies van der Rohe building itself, it's an icon. If you look at the Hans Jeroen's concert hall opposite, it's an icon. If you look at buildings in New York in the kind of 30s, they are icons. So it's, but there are also so many other things, and kind of somehow what kind of at some point panicked me is that the identity of the architect was kind of shrunk to an extremely embarrassing word, but it seemed that also the potential actions or intentions of an architect would shrink to only that one kind of form of production, an icon. So that's why I've been agitating against that kind of situation very much.
And you've said in conversation with me before that exhibitions are kind of refuge from that.
Yeah, well, I think the word iconic is kind of rarely being applied to an exhibition. Mm-hmm. And so for that reason, I was actually very happy to when you proposed to me to talk about exhibitions, because it's exactly what why I think it's such an important not escape, but such an important dimension to deal with. Because you can also explain this kind of thing, which in a way that you can never explain kind of around the building.
Mm-hmm.
what this building, if anyone would be able to get ever inside, this building is also deeply influenced by kind of art. I think that in it there is a kind of structure that is sometimes kind of very prominent, and that is almost how shall I say it, almost magically coinciding with the vocabulary of Tony Smith, who is somebody I deeply kind of admire, and so, which is, for instance, another kind of dimension that is never discussed. So I feel that in spite of many pretensions of multidisciplinarity, at this point, art is in a kind of bubble, and architecture is in a bubble, and I think that they're very rare that those bubbles can meet.
Okay, so continuing on the issue of the icon, but maybe a resistance to the icon, I think we can jump to elements.
Okay, nice.
Talk about.
A nice jump. Here, this was extremely, interesting to try to disorient in something as clear, transparent, and crystalline as Mises architecture, and to try to disorient the experience, and that is also where I felt kind of very that I was actually doing something that was Miesian, as I tried to do in the building, by the way, as well. That was Miesian, but that dimension, even knowing that dimension was kind of almost invisible. Okay, so elements of architecture. This is why this kind of spreadsheet. I started with a spreadsheet because there was an unbelievable amount of organization that needed to happen, fundraising that needed to happen, and therefore communication that needed to happen. And it consisted of 3 parts: a show about Italy, a scan of Italy, and all the different nations participating in Biennale were asked to represent the last 100 years of their history in architecture, and basically that meant in coming to terms with or absorbing modernity. That became a very wonderful part of the exhibition, because although you would expect that each country adopting modernity would begin to look more and more similar, what it can really revealed that all those modernities were extremely different, that all the uses of modernity were extremely different and kind of unique, that all the political systems that used modernity could diverge more and be more different from each other. So it was a wonderful experience to enrich the whole perception of this terrible kind of journey to homogeneity. Anyway, and I was, and so this is an example, and also of the kind of richness within modernity of certain of the narratives. This is a panel, a Russian concrete panel, which the Russians developed in the kind of 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s to deal with their kind of housing problem. And of course, that was then transported, or at least the ideas were applied in East Germany, when East Germany still existed. And kind of somehow the East Germans exported as part of national help of the government of Chile when Salvador Allende was president, one of those panels. So it was the history of a panel, kind of as a Russian idea, East German kind of realization that then kind of was applied in a totally Catholic context of Chile. And so it documented also all the identities along the way. The French did something kind of really ingenious. They took the film Mon Oncle of Monsieur Hulot of Jacques Tati and used that as a kind of, maybe a modernity more significant, more popular, and more certainly more fun than the kind of harsh modernity of the known names. But I was interested in doing something which is called elements of architecture. And what we try to do is to represent the biennales are typically demonstrations of architectural prowess, and so a typical biennale consists of future masterpieces of selected architects. What I wanted to do is look at the history of architecture and look at all the elements that are blatant, such as a floor, a wall, a ceiling, a toilet, stairs, fireplace, window, that are used by every architect, that everyone kind of understands. And I wanted to document also their histories, both in time and across the world. So very ambitious, but you see perhaps in this kind of first one, how this exhibition worked. And this was a ceiling, and the ceiling decorated with a mural. This is the current version of a ceiling, a plane that is kind of fairly neutral, behind which there is an enormous apparatus that maintains kind of human life, and that is kind of mostly invisible, and that is also inaccessible to any kind of architectural speculation, because this is the architect, but this kind of reality behind the screen is a kind of no-go area. And therefore, what I was kind of interested in showing is how different technologies and different, and particularly electronic devices that are becoming more and more embedded in architecture, and actually how architecture is now in many ways defined and invaded by the digital, without the architectural world actually being aware of that kind of almost. So it was, for me, also basically a drastic way to assert that conviction, to assert the increasing flimsiness of architectural construction, to increase, this is the history of the toilet, but this is the current situation of the toilet, where basically whatever you leave is being analyzed at the same moment, kind of electronically, and basically given back to you in terms of digital information. And
we
so,
have a question from the audience, Rem, if I can interrupt you. Could you talk a bit more about using taxonomy as a vehicle for critical curatorial practice, as seen in this installation at the Biennale? And I would add also that there's a long history of exhibiting architectural fragments as well. And I was just wondering if you were in dialogue with that in terms of the research process and the design conversations early on.
well, I think that yes, elements of architecture is a kind of very very familiar title. There is an element of architecture by Semper. There is English, even older English kind of elements of architecture, and of course all of those have have a mission, and they are typically almost theories as well, and we looked at the history of that taxonomy, and we looked also at the history of those kind of books, and almost all of them were dedicated to either kind of what is it? Either to kings or to aristocratic figures or to presidents or to people in power. So there was always, an element of architecture was always kind of announcing a new way or a new possibility of doing architecture. And basically, I was kind of really struck by the way that no one in their right mind today would do that, would dedicate it to somebody. There's simply no credible figures anymore that you would want to dedicate something Steve Jobs that would feel kind of horribly opportunistic. And so it was basically the taxonomy after the taxonomies. Yeah? So it was more, a screenshot, you could say, of a development, of an ongoing development, and maybe that development I was not kind of particularly happy with. And particularly the encounter with electronics, I thought was needed at least to be discussed. Because here you see another kind of way that your floor can be sensitive to the imprint and the different weight distribution of your body. So it would can record the fact that you fell, and you in this case would be typically an old person, and basically that kind of record could not only be something that you experience at home, but it could be directly shared with the hospital or the doctor, so that falling would be almost coinciding with an ambulance a couple of minutes later. This is another kind of form, kind of the fireplace is kind of replaced by a thermostat, but a thermostat that learns and that basically begins to anticipate kind of what you want, but that also kind of informs the kind of power station that supplies you of your likely habits of consumption. And so, this was an endless series of interventions that radically changed kind of architecture, and that I at least had never kind of really seen discussed in any architecture. That there is supposedly excitement in architecture about the digital, but it's almost all about kind of how maybe in the future you can print your house, or how you can mass customize unique forms. But somehow this theme of radical infiltration and in the name of sustainability, even kind of situation where in the future you might not be able to open your own windows if the conditions are not right. All of that I felt was crucial to discuss.
Mm. Okay, and so this question about technology or the under-recognized developments is also continued in terms of the countryside exhibition, where you, let's say in elements, you're going from the domestic, we can loosely say, to a larger geopolitical concept.
I should say that kind of basically I'm far from a technophobe, so it is nothing. It's definitely not that I'm not believing in technology. And for instance, in terms of sustainability, we have collaborated in kind of really, with scientists and engineers that have amazing new tools to actually not only minimize energy, but generate energy in buildings. So I definitely think it's a kind of entirely and totally exciting field. But it was a kind of internal criticism to architecture, and maybe you can see the role in the last two shows I'm doing. I'm talking as an architect and maybe primarily to other architects. And so that was certainly the case in Countryside the Future in New York, the show that opened on the 20th of February last year, and that was closed 3 weeks later. We opened in October. It was the Guggenheim. Guggenheim, a wonderful building. Typically, there have been architect shows in the Guggenheim where the architect confronted, in quotes, Frank Lloyd Wright. We did the opposite. We basically use Frank Lloyd Wright's building as a tool and use the compartmentalization of the kind of structure or the niches as accommodating different episodes in what we wanted to convey. Essentially, the exhibition is about kind of looking at the exhibition is essentially about an over concentration on the kind of urban condition. Somebody the UN mentioned in 2007 that half of mankind lived in cities at this point, and that by 2050 that might be 70 or 80%. That has been the pretext to go and be almost exclusively interested in the city, develop theories about the city, statistics about cities, exhibitions about cities, book about cities. And I felt that in the end, there was a kind of really serious possibility, not so much of neglect, but of not understanding what is going on in the countryside and what is the role of the countryside and what could be the role of the countryside. So we looked at basically 15 conditions distributed over the entire world and kind of reported about those conditions.
Can I ask you, when you were developing the project or at the very early stages thinking about this, what was the architecture community your audience, or were you thinking more generally? And also, you know, like from the beginning, you knew that this would be an exhibition, or had you thought about it as a book first?
No. It started as a kind of private realization, and then kind of basically a number of conversations and a number of interactions with politicians, farmers, and simply trying to create a kind of base for myself to understand it, and then the whole notion of an exhibition was triggered by the government that basically invited us to, after maybe 5 years of involvement, to whether we were interested in doing a show. And it was, of course, very experimental for them too, because it was the first time that an art institution in New York, and I think in the whole of America, would be dedicated to an exhibition that was entirely unrelated to art and even to architecture. So a genuine experiment. Anyway, I wanted to give it a context, and one of the contexts, and this is maybe, you know, with this a bit quote, or that I wanted to kind of show that basically, while we currently, and many politicians don't have an idea at all about the countryside, never mention the countryside, and apparently never think about the countryside, never go into the countryside anymore. And the whole model of an airplane hub is you know, the typical model of our movement, but maybe also of our thinking. You know, we go from hub to hub, and have forgotten the way to actually traverse the in between. That basically, whether it was dictators, president, Democrats, bureaucrats, that basically the entire world from China to Europe to America was deeply, and even to Africa, was deeply involved in the countryside and in developing ideas for the countryside, having massive operations on the countryside, trying to correct things in the countryside, and that the countryside was, you know, a major preoccupation of the 20th century agenda. So that was one crucial thing to kind of show. This was a kind of Russian movie from the 50s that in a way glamorized the countryside and labor in the countryside. And while this is maybe the countryside today, this is Qatar, which after blockades by its Arab neighbors, basically had to import, I think, 5,000 cows in 3 months and create a total factory for milk production almost overnight, where the entire personnel is dressed in kind of this kind of outfit, yeah, and where any kind of reference to nature is almost completely absent. So I also wanted to say massive things are changing in the countryside, again, without our consciousness. This was another important message. This is a way in which in China you can now, on your mobile phone, communicate directly with different specific farmers, specific fishers, specific suppliers in the fields or on sea. And this is a method that completely cuts the intermediary out of the kind of process. So it's both cheaper, more humane, and more kind of personal, obviously. And then Alibaba is able to ship whatever you buy in 24 hours to the consumer, and a kind of radical way of, in a way, bringing countryside to the urban condition and creating new forms of exchange. Here you see kind of some of those messages. So that was another kind of form of something that I wanted to kind of really report on. And maybe, and this is technology, but the technology of a kind of very interesting and ambiguous way, because it's not only hyper-modern, but also including kind of wisdom of the ages, something which is a method which is called pixel farming, where you don't plant kind of single species in enormous territories and then kind of produce as much as possible with fertilizer and insecticides. Creation of the combination of different plants that are mutually beneficial when they grow in proximity on very small miniature plots that are harvested kind of by robots, and that have the ability to also, and this is somewhat speculative, but kind of right now in experimental nature, they have the ability to produce more, but without for fertilizer, of course, and etc. etc. So this is one of those new technologies that I'm kind of deeply excited about. And then, you know, this diagram looks in kind of reality like this. You still can recognize the different conditions, the different groups, but you also see new mixing. So maybe this is the nicest image to end my presentation, but maybe not the conversation.
Yeah, so I'll pose one question and follow it with one that came in from the chat. So let's say, broadly speaking, you know, could you say that this project is about infrastructure? Just thinking about an interchangeability of terms, because countryside, as you know, you've read reviews, has kind of been a trigger for a lot of people, and there've been a lot of opinions about treating this as a concept. And so this ties into the question that came in from the chat, and I'll try to summarize it because it's a little bit long. This person says, there's a tendency, especially in architecture shows, to comment on very broad subjects, such as the countryside, and we could even say the image of Europe is also attempting this as well, these broad concepts. So it's approaching these in a totalizing way and with a lot of authority, or let's say with an authoritative voice. This tone makes the gaps of an exhibition project even more apparent. So let's say the Sisyphean task of doing an encyclopedic overview. And this person points out in particular Latin America and a lot of other parts of the world are very noticeably left out from this project. So this person is curious to know what your thoughts are on
okay. I'm very happy with the question, because it kind of encapsulates in a kind of fairly good way some of the criticism. Let me start with the simple thing. Latin America is not left out. There is a kind of whole section on Chile, on kind of American billionaires buying large areas of Chile and in a way choking Chile kind of through preservation. So that is completely incorrect. Also, I think that there is absolutely zero attempt to be authoritative. And that is actually perhaps one of the kind of crucial things to understand about my mentality. I am kind of really almost aggressively unauthoritative, and I think that ironically that makes people kind of sometimes nervous, because I don't assume the authority I'm kind of supposed to have. If you look at my teaching, and I think there's a very close relationship between teaching and this kind of exhibition, because it's also kind of partly kind of generated in collaboration with the students. In this case, actually students from Harvard, from Nairobi University in Kenya, with CAFA students from Beijing, and with students from Wageningen University, so 4 different universities. They all are based on situations where initially and where I declare that I don't know anything. And that basically with students, I'm making a serious effort to understand things. I think that I started also with Mies about kind of not understanding things. And so you could see all this work as efforts to explore and to maybe learning is a kind of soppy word in the kind of current moment, but to explore and to accumulate knowledge, to acquire knowledge, to generate new knowledge, and to declare perhaps a beginning of understanding. And so I'm actually kind of really mystified how on one hand I can be kind of so explicit about exactly that aspect, and yet be confronted with the word totalizing if I start the exhibition by saying, and also this presentation, we looked at 15 different kind of conditions. I think that is the opposite of totalizing. But anyway, I'm happy with this question, because it also enables me to emphatically deny it, or contradict it rather than deny it.
But I think also the fact that we cycled through so many different types of projects, which show different contexts and scales. I mean, had the Guggenheim show perhaps been in a different setting or a much smaller environment, the effect or that authoritative tone that this audience member is citing might have been interpreted differently, because there's nothing humble about the Guggenheim. This is an incredibly grand, so it's hard to not be authoritative in that context, I think, or to sound authoritative. Let's say.
I beg to differ. Yeah, I see the Guggenheim as a kind of fairly experimental thing, with a kind of really with an architect taking colossal kind of risks, and with an outcome that is still controversial to this day. And I think that's not a kind of sign of authoritativeness, but for me that's a sign of the continuing relevance of experimentation.
Yes, and risk-taking is definitely what you do well.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great way to end the program. Rem, I want to thank you again so much for spending all this time with us today. And I really appreciate also all the preparation in creating this new talk, because you haven't actually given a presentation of this type before. So our huge thanks to you. And also, I'd like to once again thank the Butler-VanderLinden family for their support of today's program, and to our audiences, thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also thank you really so much for thinking of this format, which was kind of very enjoyable and instructive for me. Thank you.